When you hear about video game preservation, you may think that the companies who make them are doing something to help archive their works. But it may shock you to learn that the video game industry is one of the leading obstacles in video game preservation. Although a lack of video game preservation may not impact you now, it will have consequences in your future. Video games document the rise of the industry and the influence of our culture today. Our works of art and historical objects that are showcased in museums have lasted throughout those ages for a variety of reasons, but the most important reason is that someone cared and took an active role in preserving them. I'm a former video game journalist and have done extensive research on how to archive these digital works in preparation for my career path to be a video game archivist. And I've concluded that the leading issue of video game preservation stems from the industry itself. Today, I'll explain to you how the video game industry is roadblocking preservation efforts, how you can push for them to change, and what the future may look like with their help. Around the 1970s, we left the Industrial Revolution behind and rapidly entered the information age. During this time, video games were becoming a common household item thanks to Atari, Nintendo, and later Sega. In the last 8 years, we have started to make efforts in archiving video games. And that's because the video game industry is focused on the next big thing to make a profit and are reluctant to work with the preservation community. The Library of Congress sponsored the project Preserving Virtual Worlds that focused on developing methods for preserving digital games and interactive fiction on a large scope by including several games from different platforms, years, and intellectual property status to better prepare for curation. Even during this project, it was hard to collaborate with video game companies. The final report stated, game companies may be unwilling or unable to part with their materials. Many see handing over source code like handing over the crown jewels. I experienced this tight-lipped secrecy firsthand during non-disclosure agreement drop dates as a journalist. Now, not all companies do this, but video game journalists may be given early access to a company's intellectual property, NIP, before the general public. Articles can't be published until the exact day and time that has been agreed upon between the publishers and the video game company. The companies can't share their information with anyone in case it could help with competition. And the goal of the video game industry is essentially to make money. In Preservation of the Video Game, Allison Hudgen explains how there is extreme pressure exerted by the gaming companies to value the newest game and denigrate the older ones, and that companies make little effort to keep them on the market. This is because of a bit of the business model explained by James Newman in Illegal Deposit Game Preservation and as Software Piracy. He states the games industry is essentially founded upon business models and discursive practices that effectively wear out its past and present in order to sell the innovations and revolutions of the future. And the business practice of game studios has been under scrutiny in the news recently because of the monetization with loot boxes, several layoffs, and studio closures. I watched as many of my friends were laid off, even though the company had hit record earnings for 2018. Record earnings. That's because the investors anticipate profiting from the company, and the CEOs are required to make cuts so the profit isn't dead even for those investors. Thus, archiving a company's many IPs simply isn't profitable. There's no revenue in documenting the data, notes, artwork, and concepts. And the work required to do just that would be a net loss, since the company would be paying someone to do internal work that will never be seen or paid for by the consumer. Unfortunately, the industry won't change on its own. It will require the government to step in and mandate changes. We've already seen these government mandates in effect with the policy changes implemented to Section 1201 in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 2006, 2015, and then in 2018. and then when video games were recognized as an art form by the National Endowment of the Arts in 2011. That's why I want to propose a policy change to get the video game industry involved in efforts of preservation. Over half of American adults play video games, according to a Pew Research in 2015. That's over 100 million voters who can help promote a policy change to their representatives in Washington, D.C. But it must be set up as a compromise that the industry can agree upon. Again, I want to remind you that we've only started making efforts in preserving video games in the last 8 years, and that not much really has changed. It took 6 years for emulation to be allowed as a form of preservation in a 2018 Copyright Act update. And while emulation is a solution for preserving video games, they're often designed by a third party, and updates to them may stop once the third party loses interest, as explained in Keeping the Games Alive, Evaluating Strategies for the Preservation of Console Video Games. Hardly any emulator exists in a final version that can perfectly emulate all games for a system. Which is why the policy I have in mind would focus on the companies who design and produce hardware for video games, like Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. They would be required to build an emulator for their systems that would support the games throughout the entire lifespan of each system. In return, the video game companies who shared the source code of their older IPs for preservation will be given a tax deduction similar to the individual charitable donations. Now, imagine 5 to 10 years from now going to visit a museum because they're exhibiting video games from the 1977 to 1983. The exhibit goes through the rise and fall of video games in the United States. So you'll have Atari, Magnavox Odyssey, Intellivision, ColecoVision, Commodore 64, and Vectrex would be as the major systems during this time and would be on display near a screen. Developer concepts, notes, and artwork would tell the story of the era. Instead of selecting video games that were voted on like the Smithsonian's The Art of Video Games, the museum would have all playable titles that could be emulated through gaming stations for each system. They would even include arcade games and maybe Nintendo's Game & Watch handhelds. And finally, on the museum website, video game companies would be listed who provided the source code for each game title that was successfully archived with them. This two-part policy would benefit not only the preservation community, but would give the video game industry the incentive they would need to help. The preservation community will gain a solid foundation in how to approach documenting and archiving the digital worlds, so future generations would learn the influences the information age had on us. And the gaming industry would be monetarily incentivized to put in the effort in preserving their IPs moving forward. Which is why we need to advocate for a policy change within our government, so the video game industry becomes an ally rather than an obstacle in video game preservation. The way to start is to visit house.gov and senate.gov to find your Congress officials and send them an email or letter to push for this policy change to mandate emulation and offer tax deduction for IP source codes for preservation. Without it, the video game industry will continue to be disconnected to the history that they are allowing to disappear as they chase the next big hit. But their help would lay the foundation for preserving the digital age as we advance our technology. Otherwise, the data of video games will be lost like the Great Library of Alexandria. Thank you.